This is a moviola.
It's a machine for editing film. Here, films are salvaged, saved sometimes from disaster or savaged out of existence. And this moviola, this filmmaker's tool, is the last stop on the long road between the dream in a filmmaker's head and the public to whom that dream is addressed.
There are dozens of films that have been re-edited and released as director's cuts, extended, unrated versions, and special editions. And there are many different circumstances why filmmakers have made changes to their films after their initial release.
I don't know why he saved my life.
Some for better, and some for worse.
I bet you have.
This video will break down how different edits of a film can affect the overall story, and focus on one filmmaker's struggle to reason with the studio over how that story was assembled. This is the Orson Welles Memo. Touch of Evil is a film noir about police corruption in a Mexican border town, and it's written, directed by, and stars Orson Welles, who is widely considered to be one of the greatest filmmakers of the 20th century. However, not a lot of people have seen or even heard of this film, and if you have seen it, chances are you've only seen the theatrical version from 1958 released by Universal. This version of the film was what the studio had assembled after Welles was fired from the project during post-production.
You've been denied the cutting room before.
Several times,
just
yes,
recently
happens constantly.
on a Touch of Evil.
Yes.
They loved the rushes. Then they saw a rough cut of it. They were so horrified that they wouldn't let me in the studio.
The studio then hired another director to write and shoot new clarification scenes of exposition.
Well, this kid, who was he?
Then they tweaked and restructured some of the sequences in the edit. Before its release, Welles had seen what the studio had done to his film and shot back with a passionate 58-page memo to the head of Universal, pleading to correct these changes to how he intended the story to be told. The studio implemented a few of Welles's notes and threw away the rest. Then Touch of Evil was released, double billed as a B-movie, and basically swept under the rug. Then in 1976, more footage from Touch of Evil was uncovered from the Universal archives, and an extended cut of the film was released. However, neither of these versions addressed the remaining notes laid out in the Welles memo. So then in 1998, using the elements from both versions, film editor Walter Murch recut the movie based on what Welles had initially intended. So today I'd like to focus on that vital stage in the storytelling process, editing, and examine the Orson Welles memo of Touch of Evil to compare and contrast how these editorial changes impact the overall story. This memo is a rare glimpse into the creative process of editing, the in-between stage from rough to final cut. It addresses what changes should be made, but more importantly, why these changes should be made, based on how the audience will be presented the story. Welles begins by stating, quote, "I must face the strong probability that I am the very last person whose opinion will be likely to carry any weight with you. I am, therefore, limiting myself to points which might genuinely interest you, points which seem to me to interfere quite actively with the story itself, and tend to confuse the narrative line." Keep in mind that Welles and the studio are both aiming for the same thing, clarity, and I honestly believe each version of the film is enjoyable. So now let's take a look at some of the differences. Let's begin with setting a tone. Touch of Evil opens with one of cinema's most iconic shots. It's a 3-minute crane tracking shot following a bomb that's been planted in the trunk of a car. The studio then used this shot for the title sequence of the film. Now, Welles came from a background of radio, so he had a very elaborate soundscape in mind for this opening sequence, and he didn't want titles or theme music to be playing. He says, "As the camera roves through the streets of the Mexican border town, the plan was to feature a succession of different contrasting Latin musical numbers. The effect, that is, of passing one cabaret orchestra after another. The fact that the streets are invariably loud with the music was planned as a basic device throughout the entire picture." Now, the studio added titles simply because that's the way things were done at the time. However, Welles believed that titles and theme music psychologically make the audience feel safe. Here's Walter Murch to explain why.
So there they are walking through the town, and oop, there's that music, and there's a car. And right now, boom, that car could have blown up. But if there are titles over that, you just know it's not going to blow up. So by removing the titles and having this sort of free-form music, it puts a suspense under this scene that didn't really exist before.
As I've said before, each version of the film is enjoyable. However, each one also sets a very distinct tone from the start. Anyway, since this is a single shot, there's not much else to analyze here in terms of editing, but you'll find that Welles's coverage of the scene is very deliberate. There's hardly ever a wasted shot, and his films are designed to be assembled in a very specific way. Now let's look at nonlinear versus chronological storytelling. It's important to keep in mind that editing a feature film is different than editing a single scene. A scene tells a part of the story, but it also needs to be in context to how the scene fits into the overall story as a whole, which is what the basis for Welles's next series of notes focuses on. So once the car explodes, our main characters separate. Vargas, a Mexican narcotics officer played by Charlton Heston, heads to the crime scene. Meanwhile, his wife Susie, played by Janet Leigh, heads back to the hotel. And Welles's intention was to cross-cut between these two storylines. However, the studio simplified this cross-cutting and divided the sequence into two sections, Vargas's story and Susie's story. So how did the studio combine these scenes? By hiding a jump cut with a cutaway shot of a gang member. These scenes were not written or filmed to be continuous, and you can hear the change in the audio.
I may be scared, but he won't be.
Who wants to make trouble?
Trouble? As a matter of fact, Mike must be looking for me just about now, and that's bound to mean trouble. What's so funny about that?
As a direct result of combining these two scenes, the scene that was supposed to go between the two now has to get awkwardly combined. Here you'll see this cut is also very abrupt.
Who? Whoever did it, you jackass.
You figured it was a bomb then, Hank. Well, Chief Rudy Lenniker could have been struck by lightning.
Welles assumes that the studio did this to make it easier for the audience to understand what's going on. Upon viewing how the studio cut this sequence, Welles stated, "Dividing the scene in two parts as we intended, and keeping the situation with Vargas at the scene of the explosion alive in the audience's mind, is not to confuse but to clarify. We would not have left the scene of the explosion until after all of our principal characters had been established." So here's how the scenes would have cut based off his instructions.
Well, here comes Hank at last. Vargas, you've heard of Hank Quinlan, our local police celebrity. I'd like to meet him. That's what you think.
Did they toss it in, or was it planned it ahead of time? Who? Whoever did it, you jackass.
The other thing this intercutting does is tell you that both stories are important. The man's story is important and the woman's story is important, and how they relate to each other is important. Ironically, by trying to make the film simpler, the studio complicated things because they told you that the film was going to be about Charlton Heston.
Yeah, I hear you even invited some kind of a Mexican.
Welles continues by stating, "What's vital is that both stories, the leading man's and the leading woman's, be kept equally and continuously alive. Each scene should play at roughly equal lengths, leading up to the moment at the hotel when our lovers meet again. No point concerning anything in this picture is made with such urgency and such confidence as this. Do please give it a fair try." So here's how Welles had designed the scenes to be cut together.
I'm merely what the United Nations would call an observer.
I don't talk like one, I'll say that for you. Mexican, I mean.
Captain, you won't have any trouble with me.
You bet your sweet life I won't.
As a matter of fact, Mike must be looking for me just about now, and that's bound to mean trouble. What's so funny about that?
The studio felt audiences wouldn't be able to track the narrative line if it had jumped back and forth too much. However, there's a difference between a filmmaker building mystery and intrigue versus a filmmaker failing to communicate information about the plot.
There's no law against visitors asking questions, is there, Mr. Vargas? Hey, where'd he go?
If the audience is confused and doesn't understand what's going on, then it is appropriate to reassess the cut, make changes, and possibly even reshoot or add a scene. So let's talk about reshoots. The lobby scene comes just after the border crosscut sequence and was added after Welles had been taken off the picture. He didn't write or direct it. This scene was shot to essentially just have these characters explain what just happened.
Well, that's all I remember, Mike. He said his name was Granby. I remember that.
Well, this kid, who was he?
Welles found so many problems with this added scene that the studio couldn't possibly ignore. He says, "This particular new scene goes directly against the intentions of the script and the original line of the story." Welles continues by calling attention to the problematic dialogue at the end of the scene. Vargas tells his wife to be sure to lock the door, yet we will later see him open this door by a simple turn of the knob.
Susie.
Her failure to do so is underlined, and the audience, forced to think about this whole door locking business, is given the choice between blaming the director for carelessness or considering that the character played by the leading lady is flighty to the point of feeble-mindedness. So in order to prevent the audience from focusing on this needless detail, the studio adhered to Wells's note and removed that line of dialogue. However, now the scene abruptly ends.
Now they're pushing my wife around.
Can't we forget about that?
Wells then makes the case to remove the scene entirely. He says, "This added dialogue makes the later scene in which Susan packs and stamps out of her hotel room completely arbitrary.
Susie.
The new lobby scene leaves our couple in a fairly warm relationship.
All I want to do is to get out of here.
Look, Susie, I'll get you out of here.
By sweetening their relationship at the wrong moment, there is a sharp loss in dimension, and both Vargas and Susan emerge as stock characters." So again, on the surface, a scene like this can stand perfectly fine on its own, however it needs to be in context to how it fits into the story as a whole. Let's move on to our last section, fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is a huge part of the editing process, and there are subtle changes that can really help build and shape moments for your characters. So let's quickly compare and contrast several fine-tuning moments in Touch of Evil. There's a scene in which Vargas enters a blind woman's shop to make a call to his wife. However, the studio decided to reframe this shot to crop the blind woman out. Wells says, "I note with distress that she was not there by accident. Her presence embarrasses Vargas and inhibits his conversation with Susan. This provides a curious note of minor tension which will be missed. It seems a shame to disrupt this simply because it struck someone that the woman sitting in the foreground was rather peculiar. It was meant to be peculiar."
Quinlan is about to arrest that boy Sanchez.
Oh, Mike, is that why you called? To tell me somebody's been arrested?
No, that's not really why I called. It's to tell you how sorry I am about all this.
Thankfully, the studio took Wells's note and left the scene as he intended. Let's look at another moment. In the Hall of Records, a close shot of Menzies looking up from the table has been put back into the scene.
The dentures in the Yule case, the lead pipe. Go on, tear them. It's all there in the record.
All these years he spent
All these
building up
years he's
a
been
reputation.
planting evidence. Framing suspects.
That's a lie.
I had cut this because of mistaken use of a wide-angle lens which distorts Menzies' face so grotesquely as to bring the scene itself to a dead stop. The scene played all right without this weird close-up. So here it is without that.
Are you telling me you never planted any evidence, Sergeant?
Of course not. Neither did Hank.
It's all
Never.
there. The axe and the burger slaying, the dentures in the Yule case. Planting evidence. Framing suspects.
That's a lie.
I think I can prove it, Sergeant.
Sure.
As it used to be, he was diminished in importance because he was always held down, strangely, by this one close-up. It's a fascinating example of the effect of a certain kind of editorial change where you can simply take one thing out. The balance of a whole character in the film is very different.
Then there's this final moment between Quinlan and Marlene. Here, Walter Murch breaks down the difference between these two.
The way it had been cut by the studio, there was a final look between the two of them as he left. A subtle thing again, but what Wells wanted was to delay that look and have her look up only after he left the room.
So here's how Wells wanted it.
She was busy doing her accounts, so that she hears the squeak of a chair, looks up, and it's too late. His back is moving out of the room.
This example is precisely why fine-tuning these details is so important. It's the right shot in the wrong spot. These characters weren't meant to have connected and shared this final moment, which leads us to the climax. Quinlan's death. The difference between these two versions again is subtle. However, one thing is missing. Here's the studio version. Wells said at the very end I had a particular arrangement of short cuts building up to Quinlan's collapse into the water of the canal. This involved the closing of the recording device, the backing up of Quinlan, his dead body dropping into the water, and other moving shots arranged in a very fast crescendo. As I left it, this brief montage, although not exactly as I wanted it, was quite close to being right. And honestly, I believe it was, or would have been, one of the most striking things I've ever had anything to do with.
What Welles wanted to say was, I was killed by the tape recorder. In some way, this machine hit me, and that's the thing that did me in.
So as you can see, there's a decision behind every edit, large and small. And I hope this video has helped shed some light on that process. The editing of a film is often difficult to examine, so our goal here was to demonstrate how even the most seemingly minor cut can have a great storytelling influence on your film as a whole. I'd also like to give a special thanks and shout out to Lawrence French and Wells.net for supplying such a thoroughly comprehensive breakdown of this memo. And of course a special thanks to producer Rick Schmidlin and editor Walter Murch for creating this cut of the film. If you're interested in reading the entire memo or learning more about Wells's career, we've provided links below for you to explore. Now I'll leave you with some final words from the man himself. Thanks for watching.
Plato told us that we should know ourselves, and the object of every artist, good, bad, or indifferent, is a lifelong inquiry into that subject, and his work is testimony to that effort. But I'm in no position to sum myself up, and I would be appalled if the truth could be offered to me at this moment.
Orson Welles, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.